He never raised his voice, not even then. He just stopped talking mid-sentence, his fork hovering inches above his plate, and stared at me like he was seeing a stranger for the first time. Around the table, the conversation collapsed into silence. My sister froze. My brother avoided my eyes. My father cleared his throat and looked down at his hands. No one laughed anymore. That was the moment my family finally understood that I had never been powerless at home. I had simply chosen not to use my rank. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why that dinner ended the way it did, you need to know how carefully I had learned to stay quiet, and how much patience it took to let them believe my silence meant submission. My name is Rachel Turner. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my adult life, I served in the military. I won't bore you with my resume. It's not the point. What matters is that my career taught me two things very well: discipline and timing. At home, though, none of that seemed to matter. I grew up in a family where hierarchy was loud and constant. My father had opinions about everything. My older brother inherited his confidence without earning it. My younger sister learned early that staying agreeable was easier than being heard. When I enlisted, my family reacted the way they always did when I stepped outside their expectations. They laughed it off, told people it was a phase, said I'd be back once I realized how hard it was. When I wasn't back, they stopped talking about it altogether. I didn't correct them. I didn't push my achievements into conversations. When I came home for holidays, I wore civilian clothes, helped in the kitchen, listened more than I spoke. I let my rank stay where it belonged, outside the house. At first, it felt like maturity. Then it became habit. Over time, the jokes started. My brother would tease me about playing soldier. My father would ask when I planned to get a real job. My sister would smile, apologetically, and change the subject. None of it was cruel enough to confront. It was just dismissive. And dismissal has a way of wearing you down quietly. I told myself it didn't matter. I had my own life, my own career. Their opinions didn't affect my reality. What I didn't notice at first was how comfortable they were becoming with my silence. Every family gathering followed the same pattern. Someone else spoke for me. Decisions were made without asking. If I disagreed, it was brushed aside as overthinking. I learned to pick my moments carefully. And most of the time, I picked none at all. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started with small things. A holiday plan announced without consulting me. A family expense I was expected to cover without discussion. Jokes that crossed from playful into pointed. Once, during a birthday dinner, my brother laughed and said, "You're great at taking orders, right?" Everyone chuckled. I smiled and took a sip of water. Years passed like that. I advanced in my career, took on responsibilities that required absolute trust, led teams, made decisions that affected lives. I learned how to remain calm when people around me panicked. At home, I washed dishes and stayed quiet. The irony wasn't lost on me. I just didn't feel the need to explain it. The breaking point came disguised as a family favor. My father decided to host a large anniversary dinner. Extended family, old friends, people who hadn't seen me in years. He asked my brother to organize it. My brother, in turn, delegated tasks without consulting anyone, including me. I was informed, not asked, that I would handle logistics, seating, coordination, payments. It was assumed I would comply. I did, not because I had to, because I wanted to see how far they would go if I let them. As the event approached, the tone shifted. My brother criticized my choices openly. My father questioned my competence in front of others. Small corrections became public comments. I said nothing. Inside, I noted everything. The night of the dinner arrived. The house was full, laughter, glasses clinking, conversations overlapping. I moved through it all efficiently, making sure everything ran smoothly. No one thanked me. During dinner, my brother stood to give a speech. It was supposed to be light-hearted. It started that way. Then he turned to me. He joked about how I finally found a use for my organizational skills. How I was good at following instructions. How I'd always been the obedient one. There it was. The table laughed. Not maliciously, comfortably. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, clarity. I didn't interrupt him. I let him finish. I let the applause fade. Then my father added his own comment, something about how family keeps you grounded. No matter how big you think you are out there. That was when I spoke. Not loudly, not sharply. I said, I've never used my rank at home. I didn't think it belonged here. The table went quiet. I continued calmly, explaining that the decisions I made at work required trust, accountability, and respect. That I had never demanded those things from my family. That I had assumed they understood the difference between silence and weakness. No one laughed. My brother tried to respond, but his words tangled. My father stared at me, stunned. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list accomplishments. I didn't threaten anything. I simply stopped shrinking. The rest of the dinner passed in awkward politeness. Conversations resumed cautiously, like people testing thin ice. After dessert, my father pulled me aside. He asked why I had never said anything before. I told him the truth. Because I was waiting to see if they would ever ask. They hadn't. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic shifted. Not dramatically, not immediately, but the jokes stopped. The assumptions faded. Decisions were discussed instead of announced. My brother apologized, awkwardly. My sister hugged me longer than usual. I didn't demand change. I let it happen. The real payoff wasn't the dinner. It was what came after. For the first time, my family saw me clearly. Not as the quiet one, not as the obedient one, but as someone who had always chosen restraint over reaction. I didn't need to assert authority. I just needed to stop hiding it. Eventually, my father told a story about me to someone else, and for the first time, he didn't minimize it. He didn't joke, he spoke with pride. I listened from the other room and smiled. Today, my relationship with my family is different, healthier, more balanced. Not because I forced it, because I waited, because I understood that power doesn't need to announce itself to be real. After that dinner, things didn't explode the way people imagine confrontations do. There were no dramatic arguments, no family meetings, no long apologies. What changed was quieter than that, and in some ways more telling. My family became careful around me. Not respectful at first, careful. As if they weren't sure where the boundaries were anymore and didn't want to cross them by accident. Conversations slowed when I entered a room. Jokes were abandoned halfway through. Decisions that used to be announced suddenly came with a pause, a glance in my direction, an unspoken question. I didn't rush to fill that space. At work, I was used to moments like that. Moments when people recalibrate after realizing their assumptions were wrong. You don't correct them immediately. You let the silence do the work. My brother was the first to test it. A few weeks later, he called me with what he framed as a favor. He was considering a career change and wanted my opinion. Not advice, he made sure to clarify, just my thoughts. In the past, I would have listened, nodded, and offered something vague enough not to challenge him. This time, I asked questions, direct ones. About preparation, about consequences, about what he was actually willing to give up. He wasn't used to that. He laughed it off at first, then grew defensive, then quiet. When we hung up, he thanked me, sounding unsettled rather than reassured. I realized then that the shift wasn't just about how they saw me. It was about how I was allowing myself to show up. I still didn't mention my rank. I didn't need to. Authority isn't about titles. It's about clarity. My father struggled more than the others. He had spent decades being the loudest voice in every room. And the idea that he might have misjudged one of his own children didn't sit easily with him. He didn't confront me directly. Instead, he asked questions through my sister, indirect and cautious, as if testing the ground. She told me he wanted to understand why I'd stayed quiet for so long. I thought about that for a while before answering. I told her it wasn't about fear or respect. It was about choice. I had chosen peace over conflict, observation over reaction. And I had assumed, wrongly, that they would notice the difference. Around that time, an unexpected situation put everything into sharper focus. A family dispute surfaced over finances. An inheritance issue that had been buried for years suddenly needed to be addressed. Emotions ran high. Old grievances resurfaced. Voices rose. For the first time, someone turned to me and asked what I thought, not sarcastically, not dismissively, seriously. I listened, I asked questions. I broke the issue down into parts, separating emotion from facts, assumption from reality. I suggested a solution that no one had considered because it required patience instead of posturing. The room went quiet again, Then my father nodded. "Let's do that," he said. It wasn't triumph I felt in that moment. It was relief. Not because I'd finally been heard, but because I no longer had to choose silence just to be tolerated. Still, not everything changed overnight. There were moments when old habits resurfaced, a comment here, an assumption there. But now, when it happened, I addressed it calmly and immediately. No anger, no explanation, just presence. The phase of apparent defeat that had defined my role for so long was over, not because I announced it, but because I stopped performing it. Looking back, I realized how much energy I'd spent managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own. I told myself I was being understanding, adaptable, flexible. In reality, I was shrinking to fit a version of myself that made everyone else comfortable. At work, that would have been unacceptable. At home, I had allowed it. One evening, my sister admitted she had always known things weren't fair. She said she admired how I handled it, how I never reacted, never lashed out. I told her the truth. That restraint isn't always strength, and silence isn't always wisdom. Sometimes it's just habit. The final shift came quietly. At another family gathering months later, someone joked about authority again. This time, my brother cut it off himself. "Not funny," he said. "She's earned her respect." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That was when I knew the change was real. Not because they feared my rank, but because they finally understood my boundaries. The truth is, I never wanted to use my rank at home. I still don't. Home isn't a command structure. It's a relationship. And relationships only work when power isn't confused with volume. In the end, my family didn't change because I pushed them. They changed because I stopped retreating. And that made all the difference. After everything settled, I thought I would feel triumphant. That was the version of the ending I'd imagined for years. The moment where everything finally balanced out and I could exhale. Instead, what I felt was quieter than that. Calmer, like a room after a storm has passed and nothing is broken anymore. The real payoff wasn't a single moment. It was a series of small ones that followed. I noticed it when my father asked my opinion before making a decision, not afterward. I noticed it when my brother stopped joking at my expense and started listening instead. I noticed it when my sister no longer tried to smooth things over on my behalf because she didn't need to. No one announced the change. No one apologized in a dramatic way. The dynamic simply adjusted, as if my family had finally recalibrated after years of misreading the signals. What struck me most was how little I had actually done. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't listed achievements or reminded anyone of my position. I hadn't demanded respect. I had just stopped minimizing myself, and that alone had been enough to force the shift. For a long time, I had believed that keeping the peace meant absorbing discomfort quietly. That if I stayed calm and flexible, things would eventually improve on their own. What I learned instead was that peace built on silence isn't peace at all. It's postponement. The difference this time was intention. I didn't swing from silence to confrontation. I didn't replace one extreme with another. I chose presence, clear, steady, unembellished presence. And that turned out to be far more effective than any argument I could have made. One evening, months later, my father and I sat together after dinner. The conversation drifted, as it often did, to family stories and old memories. At one point, he paused and said, almost to himself, that he wished he'd understood me better when I was younger. I didn't respond right away. Then I told him that understanding wasn't something he'd missed his chance at. It was something we were still building. He nodded, and that was that. There was no dramatic reconciliation. No tears, just acknowledgement. That was enough. What surprised me most was how much lighter everything felt once I stopped carrying the responsibility for everyone else's comfort. I laughed more easily. I spoke more freely. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head before family gatherings anymore. At work, nothing changed. I was the same person I had always been there. The difference was that home no longer required me to leave that version of myself at the door. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that authority doesn't have to be asserted to exist. And respect doesn't always come from being louder or sharper or more forceful. Sometimes it comes from consistency. From showing up the same way, every time, until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. I never used my rank at home. I still haven't. What I did use was patience and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are, even when others don't see it yet. If you've stayed silent in situations where you were underestimated, not because you were afraid, but because you were waiting, I hope this story resonates with you. There's a difference between being quiet and being small. One is a choice. The other is an illusion. And if you want to hear more stories about quiet strength, patience, and the kind of change that doesn't need to shout, subscribe, and stay with me. Some of the most powerful moments in life arrive softly, after a long wait.